Boker Tov, thank you all for being here as our first of 3 Shmita explorations. There are tremendous resources out there for people who want to get it more into it in between these gatherings, and we will certainly be publicizing that along the way. Many opportunities. For now, we're just opening in song and then in text, and then we're going to get a little bit to the text of our own lives and how it intersects with Torah. So Eitz Chaim Hi from Proverbs, as we close the Torah service, as we did yesterday, that Torah is a tree of life. That means that it's evolving. That means that it's constantly shedding old leaves and building new, and yet it is the same organism. And some of those, as we know, redwoods and others can last, bristlecone pine can last 4,000 years. That's how long our Torah has been around. So Torah as tree of life. I'm going to mute with apologies. There we go. Okay. So we open with just a reflection on what it means to tune in to Torah and nature in direct dialogue with one another. Eitz Chaim Hi lamachazikim ba v'tomcheha meushar deracheha darchei noam v'chol netivoteha shalom. Hashivenu Adonai Elecha v'nashuva Chadesh Chadesh Yameinu Chadesh Yameinu We were ready with a Shemitah song, and we are so thrilled for this opening panel to have Mirla Goldsmith, one of the nation's leading Shemitah agitators and educators, but she is not hearing this right now because she is out of earshot. That would be fantastic. Thank you. So in a moment, we will have Shemitah song and Shemitah skit. But because we don't want to lose any time, a quick architecture of the morning. This opening hour is Mirla and I with some exercises and approaches to Shemitah. And the song begins any moment, followed by skit. And some texts, really laying out the basis of what this whole thing is about. Then we have about a 45-minute break in person, lots of opportunities in Zoom, do whatever you like. And then we hope you'll rejoin a little before 11:30 for a remarkable panel with David Kirsch and Beth Sperber-Ritchie, Rabbi Rachel, and myself to focus on resilience, the psycho-spiritual aspects of Shemitah. Future sessions on March 19th and May 1st will focus on sustainability and on justice and some of those broad implications of Shemitah as well. So with no further ado, ready to model what it was like to be a farmer in 1909 when Rav Kook wrote Shabbat Haaretz, Mirla Goldsmith.
Are we going right to the sketch?
Song.
Song first? Okay.
Unless you'd rather save it.
Totally up to you. Bye-bye.
Go for it. Okay.
Good morning, everybody. Yeehaw, exactly. For 6 long years we've muddled along.
Page 2.
This year we can right the wrong. Why not try a change of pace and take a break from the rat race? Listen to my Shemitah pitch get ready for the 7-year switch. Fertile fields are getting worn. We can't keep planting so much corn. Leave the chemicals at the store and fertilize just with manure. That's supposed to get a laugh. Fertilize just with manure. Time to climb out of that ditch. Get ready for the 7-year switch. Drilling for coal and oil and gas, ruining the land for short-term cash, heating up the atmosphere. Let's stop it for the Shemitah year. We can't afford even one more glitch. Get ready for the 7-year switch. Mortgage, student, medical debt. The Torah says forgive and forget. Release it so we'll all be free. Reduce the inequality. We can't afford even one more glitch. Get ready for the 7-year switch. The rules of the sabbatical may sound very radical, but if we are adaptable, we can make it practical. Now's the time to scratch that itch. Let's go ahead and make the switch. Now, I hope you all forgive my ukulele playing, but now you know everything you need to know about Shemitah. It's all in that song.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. All right. We promised Mirla and Fred, and we have Mirla and Fred. We're just switching the Freds.
Excellent, Fred!
Because we wanted real farmers to play this. We are, again, circa 1909, and the early Jewish community in Palestine, not yet Israel, is figuring out how to proceed with what's in the Torah. And the Orthodox farmers are in a quandary. This is a real one that we'll look at the texts later. Right now, to introduce the broad sweep of Shemitah possibilities, for better or worse.
So, Judah, are you taking sides in the big controversy about what we should do next year?
What are you talking about?
The sabbatical year. Surely you've heard that next year is the 7th year, and some of the farmers in the new Jewish settlements here in Palestine think that we should observe the Shemitah. After all, we have returned to our homeland. Now we can keep the commandments related to the land of Israel that we couldn't observe for many centuries.
Well, now that you mention it, I did hear that some of the farmers have sent a question about that to their rabbis in Europe. Basically, I think it's crazy. Why would I want to take a sabbatical year? I might not have enough to eat. I'm barely managing to keep body and soul together as it is. I had no idea how hard it would be to live here. I was so idealistic, dreaming about the return to Zion.
Oh, I know, but I have mixed feelings. We didn't come here just to make money. We wanted to build a Jewish society and rebuild our ancient land. When our ancestors lived here, it couldn't have been much easier, and they managed to keep the Shemitah. Actually, I've been thinking about what it must have been like in those days. They must have had such strong communities. And then on the Shemitah, they would have had even more time to do things together. I imagine that the teachers from Jerusalem would have traveled to the villages, and all the farmers who usually had to work so hard in the fields would have had time to study. Maybe they had time to really enjoy the pilgrimages to Jerusalem. They could have stayed for weeks, since they didn't have to rush home for the harvest. The poorer farmers would be able to study just like the rich men, the ones who owned the wine presses and the olive presses. They would all be together.
That sounds very nice, but what did they eat? If I remember correctly, the law is that you can't plant anything. It's a Sabbath for the land, and you can only eat what grows without cultivation. What good was it to have a year of rest and even trips to the temple if they had nothing to eat?
With apologies, I think I pressed the wrong thing.
Such a dramatic moment for a pause.
There we
What
go.
do you
Yes,
all
it
think?
is. Okay. Could someone wave if you're still hearing and seeing? And there's no screen share. You're actually watching. Good. Thank you. Please continue.
Hi, Mom.
Literally.
Well, Judah,
Yeah.
they ate what they had stored from the year before. And I guess the whole idea was that they were preserving the fertility of the land. If they observed the fallow every 7 years and the soil was good and rich, some crops would grow even if they didn't plant anything for 1 year. If they had planted fruit trees and cared for them, the trees would continue to bear fruit. It almost sounds like a return to the Garden of Eden. In any case, they all shared what they grew without being cultivated. They did the minimum amount of work and they ate simply.
It must have been frightening, but I guess they had faith that with God's help, they would have enough to live on. And I suppose they knew that it would be good for the land, and if all went well, the next year's harvest would be much better because they had let the land lie fallow. But that was then, and this is now. I had a bad year last year, and I had to borrow money to tide me over. I have debts. If I don't plant and harvest my fields, I'll have no money to pay.
Oh dear. Well, they had that problem back then too. The Torah says that debts are canceled when the Shemitah comes. What do you think of that?
That's incredible. That's in the Torah too?
Well, it makes a lot of sense. If they weren't working their fields, how could they pay their debts? If rich people who did the lending insisted on collecting the debts, they would have been keeping the poor from following the law. And maybe they realized that if poor people could get back on their feet, or at least not fall further behind, it would be good for the whole community.
But what about taxes? Even back then, there were taxes.
You're right. Actually, Alexander the Great excused the Jews from paying taxes during the Shemitah year. And Julius Caesar, have you heard of him? Yeah, Julius Caesar did the same. That's according to the historian Josephus, if you trust him.
You're making me wish the Romans were still around. I don't think the Ottomans are going to go for that.
Well, after the Romans destroyed the Second Temple, they stopped being so considerate. They wouldn't exempt the Jews from taxes during Shemitah, and it became a lot harder. Not everyone could keep the Shemitah, and the rabbis started finding ways around it to help the people.
I guess that's what's going to happen now. I can't see how we can do it.
Well, the rabbis do have different opinions, surprisingly. Before he came here, Rav Kook said that we should observe the Shemitah. But now that he came here to Palestine, I've heard he has changed his mind. He thinks that it will cause too much suffering since so many of us are barely surviving already. He's agreed with Rabbi Spector. They're going to arrange a temporary sale of the land of Israel to a non-Jew. It's called a heter mechira.
In other words, a legal fiction.
Yes, well, there's a precedent for this from way back in ancient times. It seems like we've been looking for ways to get out of Shemitah since back then. You've heard of the great Hillel?
Mm-hmm.
He saw that farmers were suffering because they couldn't get loans in the year before Shemitah. The lenders knew that they would have to cancel the debts, so they just refused to give any loans. So he came up with a way for lenders to make some loans that would not be canceled. The loans would be transferred to the court, and since a court is not a person, there's your legal fiction for you, and so not bound by the rules of Shemitah, the debts could be collected. This was called the prose bull. It was very controversial because it was such a radical overturning of the law of Shemitah in the Torah.
Hillel was right. I think it's the responsibility of the rabbis to respond to the needs of the people and make sure the law is realistic.
Well, I'm sure he thought he was doing the right thing. But if you look at it another way, he was just giving in to the rich and powerful. Let them lend the money and get their money back, right? Hillel's decision undermined the entire concept of Shemitah.
So if our rabbis follow Hillel's precedent, we won't have Shemitah either. I'm still not clear. Will that be for better or for worse?
Curtain.
The question for better or worse is still with us today. Should we observe the Shemitah today or not? Take it away, Rabbi.
Awesome. So until a couple of Shemitah cycles ago, the question was to Shemitah or not to Shemitah, right? Exactly as framed. The newer approach, as we will see, and as many of you have already heard, is how to incorporate Shemitah consciousness, as opposed to whether or not to take lock, stock, and barrel a potentially unworkable piece of antiquity that also locates core Jewish values within it. So there is a world of which Mirla and I are both part that has been thinking about this since at least 2007, 2 Shemitah cycles ago, when in the Jewish environmental community, people started to ask these questions in a profound way. And many of you were around 7 years ago when Shemitah became a punchline. And thank you, there's some light applause in the background. So part of the challenge in a community like this is there's a certain expectation that we already know this. And either I've heard enough about that, you know, and die kvar, as they say, enough already with the Shemitah thing, or I heard it, I loved it, I get it, tell me more. And I guess I'm asking, wherever we are on the spectrum, to just suspend that and encounter it as the texts actually show and begin to think through collectively what this might look like, how we might locate Shemitah values in our lives today. So a bunch of texts along the way, and I'm not sure that the screen share is working great. If you guys see faces and thumbs up, if you can record them or report them to me, that would be great. I'm going for from current slide. There we go. No, come on. Okay, and then if I change display settings, is this now a it's full screen on the computer?
No, it was full screen a second ago. Now you've got the bigger picture is the woman with like this.
We have the next slide and the current slide.
That's weird. Yeah, which I had a minute ago. Oh. Oh, in that case, brilliant. Then that will solve everything if I go back to from current slide. And that's full screen. Oh, happy day. Okay. So some of you have seen this. This was actually printed at 3 High Holy Day last cycle, when we were thinking about it in 2013, when it began in 2014, and when it ended in 2015. This time, the lead up to an arrival into Shemitah coincided with COVID. And people noted along the way how suddenly the idea of resilience and cross-training and being ready for periodic dislocation, the Shemitah logic made a whole lot more sense. That this isn't just a 7th year practice, this is a lifetime resilience and readiness practice. We were caught flat-footed by COVID in oh so many ways, and Shmita Consciousness is part of what it would look like to get ready for it. We're going to go a little bit through some of these along the way and over the course of these multiple sessions as well into March and May. Chazon, the wonderful Jewish environmental organization, newly headed by our good friend from Baltimore, Yakir Manella, who briefly was involved in Adat Shalom many years ago, it took the lead under Nigel Savage 7 and even 14 years ago in really surfacing these questions. And this is from their Shemitah project: reimagine society, renew Jewish life, release the land, forgive debt, and rethink farming. And that is just for starters. Let's go to the text. How many Torah portions are there in the entire scroll? How many weeks in a year? So what's the answer? It is not 52, but it is close.
I'm going with Fred's 156, because we do a third.
Oh, I love it. 156, except that would still be solar and not lunar, so not quite. And every year, at least one of the holidays falls on a Shabbat, which changes, right? But some years are extra 13 lunar months, right? So 54 is the correct answer. All right, so Studio 54 is the Torah. And so out of those 54 Torah portions, Shemitah comes up in no fewer than 5. That's more than the vast majority of Jewish concepts. That is even more than kashrut. It is roughly tied with Shabbat. It is slightly behind sacrifices and idolatry, but it is up there, right? So in its first appearance, it's actually the oldest stratum of text. This is from right after the 10 Commandments, Exodus 21 through 23, Parshat Mishpatim. It updates a lot of the Code of Hammurabi, showing our Mesopotamian origins, and begins to introduce some of these new Israelite practices, including right here in the middle of a list of laws. And just for context, I show you the one before it. Chapter 23 of Exodus, verse 9, V'ger lo tilchetz, a stranger, a resident alien, a green card holder, someone, an immigrant, essentially, you must not oppress. For you know the heart of a stranger, you were strangers yourselves in the land of Egypt. Incredibly core Jewish teaching, immediately followed by V'sheish shanim tizra et artzacha. 6 years you shall sow your field. Va'asafta et tevuata, and you should gather your produce. V'hashvi'it, and on the 7th, tishmetena. You'll see this word over and over. I love it. It's the active verb, literally shmita it. Release it, but it's not just the word release. It's got this magic quality because of the handful of uses, and it is really radically release it. So shmita it, tishmetena, shmita it untashta, and let it rest. And then the immediate question is about food. If you actually do that, v'achlu ev yonei amecha, before asking the questions that the farmers just asked in Mirla's skit, the first question is, how are we as a society? How do the poor eat the other 6 years? This is the great leveler that begins by asking and addressing, and the poor of your people shall eat from it. V'yitram, and what's left over, tochal chayata sadeh, the wild animals should eat. Ecosystem consciousness, before we think about what's going to be in our pantries in April, before the new growing season begins. Ken ta'aseh lecharmecha v'zeitcha, etc. Right? You should do the same with all of your agricultural things, not just fields, but with your vineyard, your olive grove, etc. There we go. Okay, it just turned, right? So, yes, okay, sorry, verse 12, 6 days, we're just at the bottom, this repeats the tishmetena, but look at verse 12, 6 days do your work, on the 7th day cease from labor, lema'an, in order that, in other words, a rationale is baked here, right in the Torah's first appearance, lema'an, so that yanuach shorcha v'chamorcha, so that your ox and your ass may rest, so that vayinafash ben amitecha, literally the son of your oppressed female maid, because ama A mitcha is somewhere between a worker and a bondwoman. So the son of your maid who barely gets minimum wage and has no choices in this society, right? This is in order that they may rejuvenate. Vayinafash, vehager, and the stranger, because it's all connected to these matrices of larger social, economic, and environmental justice. At the National Chavurah Institute some years ago, a number of people took a Shemitah class and they created a zine. I've scattered a few of these, and I just love their margin commentary. You see the tishmetena, the one Hebrew word in the big script. They loved it too. And the margin questions: how will our actions actually help animals and ecosystems? Now that most of us aren't farmers, what is the equivalent of land in our lives? These are the right questions to ask. And I would bless you to have your own mental margin notes, like a page of Talmud for every text we're looking at. What are your reactions? What are your responses? I'd love to be in touch around some of that, but just for your own learning journey, let this be a bit of a model. Tishmetena. Okay. We are now between these two. We heard, oh no, sorry, Mishpatim is coming up in 5 weeks. And then there's a bit of a stretch while we talk about the tabernacle and the sacrifices. And late in Leviticus, Parshat Bahar, near the very midpoint of the entire Torah, Vaydeber Adonai el Moshe Bahar Sinai.
Rabbi Fred, I'm really sorry to
That's what
interrupt.
Moses is saying.
This
And
is
that
Cheryl. I can't
incredibly unusual.
see you.
We're way past the narrative point of being at Sinai, and yet we're invoking it. It only happens here. The rabbis have a field day with this. Out of every one of 613 commandments given after, or the majority of them given after Mount Sinai, why this and only this to be at Sinai, as if it was somehow the purpose of Sinai? We'll come back to that question. Speak to the Israelite people and say, when you enter this land I assign you, the land shall observe a Shabbat. Vishavta haaretz, Shabbat ladonai, a Sabbath to God. So the land is an actor and God is seen as wanting and deserving this. This is for the Holy One. Same that we heard before, sorry, a little too fast. 6 years sow your field, 6 years prune your vineyard, gather in the yield. Verse 4 of Leviticus 25. Uvashana hashvi'id, on this 7th year, Shabbat Shabbaton, a Sabbath of Sabbaths. Yeh la'aretz, it shall be for the land. There's an interesting parallel here of ladonai, to God or for God, and la'aretz, to the land or for the land. And if you want to go neo-pagan and say that means that God and land are one, I'm not going to stop you. So, but this wonderful, right? Shabbaton, Shabbat Shabbaton Yeh la'aretz, Shabbat ladonai, right there next to each other. It is a Sabbath of Sabbaths for the land, a Sabbath for God. Sadcha lo tizra, v'charmacha lo tizmor. Don't do agriculture. And in a society where 95% of people do agriculture for a living, right? The obvious meaning here for the average reader is don't work for a year, ergo sabbatical. Et sfiach ketzircha, whatever is the aftergrowth, whatever grows naturally on its own without tending, right? Literally after you're harvesting, and then it comes back on its own. Lo tiktzor, you still can't do that. Ve'et invei nizircha, and the grapes of your untrimmed vines, even when you let it go, you don't, right? Like essentially all of your former agriculture is off limits. It is complete rest, repeating Shabbat Shabbaton, upping the ante. V'haita Shabbat haaretz, but on this Sabbath of the land, what can you therefore eat? That's still a fair question. That whatever the land on its own produces. Now this gets a little confusing because the rabbis have to make sense of what is the category of safiach, and they basically distinguish between annuals and perennials. Things like wheat that you have to actively sow every year are not okay. But the perennials, the things that grow on their own, are. Is that a hand up?
Is there a class today?
No, there is not, but you are so welcome to join us. Good to see you, David. Yeah. So again, perennials, the hardy things that grow on their own. And Fred and other garden experts can tell us all about this key distinction, the things that don't require annual tilling, the things that are a lower impact for the soil. And this, of course, includes trees and vines and other multi-year organisms that just produce on their own. So basically, it's a fruitopia that is being described in for the 7th year. And if you practice small-scale civilization and small-scale agriculture, then there are enough fruit trees and vines and natural perennials around you to actually sustain the population. Not so in a DMV of 5.7 million statistical metropolitan area. But the more we do things like the Mishnah Garden and our own home projects, the more we approach this Shemitah consciousness, if you will. And again, the people, you may eat this along with your male and female servants or slaves, the hired and bound laborers who work with you, who live with you, and your cattle and the beasts. Again, domesticated animals, wild animals. You, the empowered, literate person who's reading this, and your hired and bound laborers and even slaves, the lowest income workers, across the human spectrum and across the species spectrum, Shmita Consciousness has it all right here in Leviticus. And that's Leviticus 25 Bahar. Some years it's matched with the next Torah portion, Bechukotai. Other years like this, they are separate. Bechukotai ups the ante. But before that, a little further in verse 10 is the famous line on the Liberty Bell, Ukaratem Torah ba'aretz l'chol yoshveha, proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. That's in the context of the 50th year Yovel at the end of 7 Shemitah cycles, but it's all connected. As is this line that many of the rabbis explicitly link to Shemitah, the land shall not be sold beyond reclaim. Va'aretz lo timakher litzmitut ki li ha'aretz, says God. The land is mine. This is the theological underpinning of all of this. We don't own the land. You, humans, says God, are but strangers and sojourners, gerim v'toshavim imadi, next to me. And that gets picked up along the way. Rabbeinu Bachya, an important early Musar thinker from the 14th century, the general principle governing the rules of conduct during Shemitah is that all activities that suggest ownership must be avoided. Any fruit or produce that grows on its own that year is ownerless, hefker. Why did that happen? Did the screen share just stop? Oh, the computer just did a weird thing. Is it still showing the same slide? Oh my gosh, this is, wait, someone is, okay, thank you. It's back. Are you still seeing it full?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know what happened there. There's someone else is moving a cursor also. So that's a little confusing. All right, hope you can all still see. Bachia, where was Bachia? Right. Oh, I see, it's on Cheryl's screen now. Okay, but that means I can't advance it. Cheryl, I don't know quite how that happened, but okay, there we go. Yes, back to Bachia. Whew, okay, hefker, ownerless. The legislation is meant to remind us, even during the years we treat the land as ours, even when we live the fallacious lifestyle of ownership deeds, even then, when the land and rights are protected by all kinds of laws against infringement by those who don't own it. Think trespassing, right? The land is really only on loan to us from God. That is Shemitah consciousness, explicitly, even during the years when we treat the land as ours. So we are not the first generation to ask these questions of what does Shemitah tell us about how we are to live our whole life, rather than 1 in 7 years, here's an ancient practice that never quite worked, so we can just ignore it. Again, the anti-ups in the next chapter, in the next parsha in Bechukotai, which is filled with a few blessings and many curses. And the curses include, if after all that you don't obey me, says God, I will discipline you 7-fold for your sins. That is not an accidental amplifier number, right? I will break your proud glory. There's something here connected to human pride that would get in the way of living out Shmita consciousness. I'll make your skies like iron, your earth like copper. In other words, agriculture ain't gonna happen. Your strength shall be spent to no purpose. Your land will not yield its produce. The trees will not yield their fruit. And then this remarkable passage, chapter 26 of Leviticus, verses 33 through 35. I will scatter you among the nations, unsheath the sword against you. Your land will be desolate. Your cities will be ruined. This is a foretelling of exile through violence. This is what will happen in 586 BCE at the hands of the Babylonians, and later in 70 CE at the hands of the Romans. Why will that happen? What happens then is the land shall make up for its Sabbath years throughout the time that it is desolate, and you are in the land of your enemies. That's when the land will rest and make up for its Sabbath years. Remember that earlier language that it is a Sabbath for the earth and it is a Sabbath for God. So the earth and God need it, want it, deserve it. And if they don't get it, they're keeping tabs. That's the image right here in Torah. Throughout the time it is desolate, meaning throughout the length of your exile, the land shall observe the rest it did not observe in your Sabbath years, the every seventh during your so-called civilization, when you said this doesn't matter and you were dwelling upon it, and it was getting less and less sustainable. Less and less sustainable from a land nutrient and topsoil health standpoint, but also less and less sustainable from a theological standpoint. And this is real. One of the earliest rabbinic commentaries, Sifra, on this, Bechukotai, makes it plain. I told you, this is channeling God as a midrash, I told you, sow your 6 years, leave that one unsown for me, so that you know the land is mine. Harking back again to that line from a minute ago from Leviticus 25. But you didn't do so. Oops. So, imdu v'gilu, get up and get out. Quite literally. Get up and exile yourselves. And the land will lie waste of itself. It will have its own. V'hi tishmat me'aleha. It will make Shemitah upon itself, because it needed it and it deserved it, and you're bad. Right? All the Shemitah years that it owes me. It is a debt, and this is not a debt that gets annulled every 7th year. Pirkei Avot, we usually go to it for all those sweet lines about, like, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? And who is rich? The one who's happy with their lot. We've got so much good stuff in Pirkei Avot. We sometimes skip the challenging ones, including this from chapter 5, explaining exile. The rabbis are already in the Roman period. They're experiencing exile. Galut ba'a la'olam. Galus, exile, comes into the world for what? They're looking to explain why these things happen, and they identify the 4 worst possible sins. These are essentially the cardinal sins that force us into the worst possible collective future, which is exile. And they are Gilui Arayot, sexual impropriety, Shvichut, Avodah Zarah, idolatry, Gilui Arayot, sexual impropriety, Shvichut Damim, spilling of blood or murder. Those are the traditional three cardinal sins, and we add a fourth, Va'al Hashmatat Haaretz, and for the Shemitah of the land. You don't do Shemitah, it is a cardinal sin. Is that a hand? Oh, okay, cool. All right. So, and in Chronicles, apparently the history was applied. There's a few late books of the Bible that speak after Babylonia and look back on that first exile and says explicitly, whoever survived the sword of those horrible years, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, exiled there. They became his and his son's servants all the way until international intrigue and the Persians arose. And why did this happen? It was limalot, to fulfill the word of God, as Jeremiah had predicted. Jeremiah also speaks of Shemitah in this way, until the land paid back its Sabbaths. As long as it was desolate, it kept the Sabbath. And that explains the length of the Babylonian exile. The math doesn't work exactly, but it shows within the later books of the Bible that this was a consciousness still very much there. So we are, in fact, all in this together. Famous parable from early rabbinic literature that because so much depends on the collective fulfillment. We will be exiled if our society doesn't keep Shemitah. It's hard to keep Shemitah alone, right? Which is also to say, perhaps our society will be exiled if we don't bring the Shemitah consciousness into our yearly practice. And we have to do this together. Similarly, someone pays for passage on a boat, takes a drill, starts drilling under their seat, says private property ownership, right? John Locke. I'm just following Western philosophy and American jurisprudence, right? And of course, everyone else says, you fool, the water will rise and drown us all. That too is Shemitah. Believe it or not, I haven't even gotten to the most radical parts yet. Debt forgiveness. And again, from that wonderful zine, think like free high quality education. Think affordable healthcare. Think affordable solar panels on your roof. Think build back better. Just saying. If Shemitah is not yet a radical enough concept for you, then let's turn to the book of Deuteronomy, the fourth Torah portion, Re'eh, in which this has an appearance. We're not right now going to talk about the fifth, that's for the afternoon, the last session, because it's about gathering the people every 7 years, Hakel, in Deuteronomy 31, just placeholder for that. So, Miketz Sheva Shanim ta'aseh Shemitah, every 7th year at the end, practice Shemitah. This is now a one-time thing, it's at the end. There's a moment when something happens. This one is a standing release of everything. Economy covers the 95% of us who were farmers, now the 3% of us who are farmers, and the 5% or now 97% of us who aren't, right? So debts are going to be remitted. How's this going to work? This is the nature of the remission. Every creditor remits the due they have claimed from their fellow. Remember that loan 3 years ago? Remember how until last week I was constantly bugging you? We're good. They shall not dun their fellow or kinsperson. This is God's remission. And should there be a needy person among you, one of your kin in any of your settlements in the land God is giving you, don't harden your heart, don't shut your hand against your needy kinfolk. Rather, patoach tiftach, open, you shall surely open yadcha, your hand, lo, to that needy kinsperson, and lend them enough for whatever they need. And human nature is already recognized in the Torah. They're already asking questions about the workability and saying, Hishamer, guard yourself, beware, lest you harbor this base thought that the Shemitah year of remission is approaching and you become mean to your needy kin and you don't give them what they need, then they will cry out to God against you and you will bear the guilt. So what they can't legislate based on human nature to say there's a logic here and there's going to be an enforcement mechanism for this seemingly unworkable thing, they up the divine stakes. Give to them readily, natom titan, give, you shall surely give, and have no regrets. Because here's the spiritual bennies. In return, the Holy One, your God, will bless you in all your efforts and all your undertakings. Here's Rav Kook, who wrote about this in 1909. The seventh year serves to rectify the social ills and inequalities that accumulate in society over the years. This is what it does. This radical socialist, ultra-Orthodox Kabbalist, Rav Kook, right? The seventh year rectifies social ills and inequalities that accumulate over the years. Come back on May 1st, Jesse and I will be talking about Shmita Economics, right? Which is a very complicated field, but we hear Rav Kook and what's the weight of Jewish tradition in viewing this. Because after all, poorer segments borrow from the wealthy, they feel beholden to the affluent elite. Here's a proof text, and this can corrupt even honest individuals. So Shemitah comes to correct the situation of inequality and societal rifts by removing a major source of power of the elite and therefore of social friction, which is debts. So we've seen what Torah says. There are people who still want to follow it. Every 7 years since the time of Rav Kook and that skit earlier, there have been people who have tried to make it work. There have been appeals to the diaspora. Please pay farmers money in Israel so they can do nothing and fulfill God's word, right? And that effort is still underway. And these lovely graphics of a very, very white farmer, right, with the sign and the big tractor with the weeds growing up around it because it's not being used for a year, right? This is the modern romanticism in the ultra-Orthodox community about trying to follow it verbatim. But we are here to talk about Shemitah Consciousness. A teacher and organizer that Mirala and I have worked with, Einat Kramer, leader of the Shmita Yisraelit, Israeli Shemitah, wrote this. The Torah relates to Shemitah primarily in the context of an agricultural society, but a contemporary approach understands Shemitah as a lens. Shemitah as a lens through which to address pressing issues in realms like education, social equity, culture, industry, and more. So let's return Shemitah to its rightful place in Jewish life as a once in 7 years chance for reflection and rejuvenation in all sectors of society. All sectors of society. Feel free to add to this list. But among the sectors of society we're addressing today, agriculture, economics, class, race, resilience, climate, spirituality, community, and the list goes on. Return Shemitah to its rightful place as a once in 7 years chance for reflection and rejuvenation in all sectors of society. So a dizzyingly fast spin through a handful of these. Agriculture, that was Gili, believe it or not, right? At the very beginning of the Mishnah Garden and the very beginning of his life, and look where it's come, and step outside in about 30 minutes and you'll see it yourself. But it's not just that, it's also our sacred grounds. The idea that we rewild elements of it, know the world as a neighborhood of non-human residents. Here's Yakir from Chazon talking about this. It's investing in regenerative, sustainable agriculture for a sustainable food system for the other years of this cycle. And it addresses the climate impacts of agriculture. We have Seth Goldman at our March session, one of the leaders of the plant-based revolution nationally in agriculture, because already the ancient laws talk about the cattle and dairy impacts on the land and the need to rethink it. The specifics of Shemitah tell us to eat seasonal, to eat local, to not waste food. This is all in the halakha. I'm quoting Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, the first great codification of the 613 commandments here, right? All of this is Shemitah consciousness direct from the halakha. Economy. We have to foster an effective energy transition in an economy that already is rife with inequality. Our work is cut out for us. But here, look on the top right, everyone has equal rights in every place. That is Shmita consciousness. There's a whole lot more that speaks to this, all kinds of good stuff. It also speaks to how we free up our own time to let our soul sing. And just sharing, just giving, which is why it's not just economy, it's really our relationship with things. And our relationship with things ultimately is our relationship with each other. My friend Rabbi Laura Bellows, in a popular source sheet on Sefaria for this, brought a lot of these texts together and then brought in Hafiz from the gift. Even after all this time, the sun never says to the earth, "You owe me." All that photosynthesis. Look what happens with a love like that. It lights the whole sky. The earth would die if the sun stopped kissing her. Giving is the nature. And it gets into modern issues of voluntary simplicity, etc. Our ingrained cultural habit is not to share. So we each have redundant things. How often do we use those things in our house that are taking up space in the storage area rather than sharing with our neighbors? What if each household stopped buying and we shared more? A sharing economy, a sharing ethos is part of this. Khalil Gibran, again, from Laura Bellows. You give but little when you give of your possessions. It's when you give of yourself you truly give. And you often say, I would give, but only to the deserving, so how's that going to work? But the trees in your orchard say not so, nor the flocks in your pasture. They don't stop to ask. They give that they may live, for to withhold is to perish. Shmita Economics. We already learned from Myrla about the prose bull that Hillel put in effect and the Heter Mechira that started in 1888 and moved forward. Since exile in the year 70, we didn't have to think about this very much, but now we do because of the climate crisis and because of the inequality crisis and because of what we know. As liberal Jews, we treat Torah lovingly, but not literally. We do that with every passage. What will it look like to take Shemitah lovingly and not literally? Not as a seventh-year radical practice that expects us to overnight undo civilization as we know it, but rather a consciousness we bring into all 7 years that may just enable us to save civilization as we know it. It speaks directly to the climate crisis and the inequality crisis. Environmental justice is the theme where those two meet. We are part of an interwoven fabric of oppressive systems, and modern people thinking about resilience are asking exactly this question. Climate change is not a thing unto itself with quick fixes. None of our problems are. We need to reduce production in part, according to the degrowth people. We'll talk about that at our economy session, with a participatory economy, with financial equity, with mutual aid networks. This is a modern secular thinker, but really talking about Shmita consciousness. We need to put that parapet around the roof of our global atmosphere, the logic of addressing this as a climate issue, right? Because we don't know how long we have. And ultimately, we're doing this for future generations. Choose life that you and your descendants may live. That's thinking in long-term cycles. And the last piece I want to locate is the power of 7 and 50-year intervals, because we live where the ups and downs of the market are every quarter. And the ups and downs of our political system are every 2 years. But when we go to heptennial, every 7, or even to the half century of the Yovel, we begin to move in a more intergenerational direction. Religion tells us to think long term. 7 years, 50 years, Lador Vador. There's a whole movement out there. We are not alone in thinking this through. And it connects to racial justice, environmental justice, love your neighbor, Black Lives Matter. And yet, we live in a system where the monopoly game never ends. And you just keep starting when some have hotels on Boardwalk and Park Place and others got nothing. The whole purpose of the covenant at Sinai is to create a society that observed Shemitah. Shemitah is a call to set apart a bubble in time and foster care, compassion, and partnership. The idea and its memory will linger on beyond the confines of the sabbatical year to the other 6 years of feverish productivity. We pick up with personal renewal and release after our break. But first, senior Shemitah educator, Mirala Goldsmith, to round out our session with some observations on what it has meant to be part of these conversations and what they might look like for us today.
We'll break out.
Okay,
Okay, everybody. Now you know a lot about Shemitah. How are you feeling? Are you feeling enthusiastic to observe the Shemitah year? Or are you feeling overwhelmed? Or how are you feeling? Fred, how are you feeling?
I am pumped up for Shmita.
Oh my gosh, great.
Into the mic. Fred Pinkney is.
Oh, he's pumped up for the Shemitah year. Who else? Mark?
I'm excited, but I have questions.
What's a question? One question.
Well, big picture, how does this work in our real day-to-day lives?
Awesome, awesome question. Yes, you have a question?
Yeah, no, we're about to answer that in the next session.
I'll be here.
Okay, Mark says, how do we observe this in our daily lives? Such a big idea. And apparently we have an answer. What's your answer in one sentence?
Oh, I'm Debbie.
Yes.
We're going to be outside and we're going to show you lots of things in the garden.
And why is that related to Shemitah?
That's part of the program in the garden.
Debbie says we're going to see in the garden how we observe Shemitah. So come on down. Who else?
Sustainable agriculture.
Yes, you have a comment?
On following Mark's questions, how do you get a sustainable society, which is not just individual action? Clearly, society did not adopt the Shemitah approach for the last couple of thousand years, so something didn't work to make that evolve.
Wonderful. What's your name?
Jesse.
Jesse says, how do you create a sustainable society? Obviously, it hasn't worked for the last few thousand years. That's a really great question. Did you mention Jeremy Benstein?
No.
No. So our teacher, Jeremy Benstein, said, if you think of Shemitah not as an answer, but as a question, it makes a lot more sense. Think of it as an idea that throws a new light and raises questions about everything in our society. And I personally find that very helpful. Any other comments? Yes. Is Shemitah just for Jews? That's a really great question. You know, that's like such a profound question about Judaism, isn't it? You know, I mean, the Christians have the same Bible, so it's in there for them too. I don't know what they say about keeping it, but I will say that the one of the things that I find most inspiring was the Jubilee Campaign. Did you mention that? No, the Jubilee Campaign was a campaign that some major anti-poverty international development organizations took on, inspired by the idea of the sabbatical and the Jubilee year to get all of the Western countries to forgive the debts to the developing countries, inspired by, and they called it the Jubilee Campaign. So even if it's not, you know, incumbent upon us, it can still be an inspiration. Any other comments? Yes.
Yeah, I like the other 6 years, the Shemitah Consciousness concept of it, and that's really worthwhile discussion, and it strikes me as a sort of a less extractive approach, environmentally or having that through the 6-year period, right? It resonates with me. I also like what you just said about it being a question.
Yeah.
So that was great.
Well, we think about it, we treat a lot of other things in Judaism that way.
Yeah.
You know, kashrut, for example, you know, as a question, you know. What else? Yes, Fred.
I guess because it's written so detailed and so literally in the text, or at least what I'm reading, maybe that sort of throws people off and they throw up their hands and they say, well, this is ridiculous. And so I think reading it as a question or a myth or a moral or whatever, I think puts you in a better place than to try to pick it apart as unworkable.
Fred said it's so detailed in the text that it makes you think that it's unworkable. But what did you say again? I'm sorry.
Well, you tend to think of it literally.
You think of it literally.
And you should think of it as a moral or.
Think of it as a moral, it might be more relatable. I actually think that it's not that it's so detailed. You know, Fred asked me to say a few words about my own journey with Shemitah. And I had the very good fortune to, at the time of the last Shemitah year, to be working at Chazon, the Jewish Environmental Organization. And Nigel Savage, the director, he brought in a Rabbi Ari Hart from the Chovevei Torah Yeshiva to teach us about Shemitah. So we had like I forget now, maybe like a 6-week seminar or something on Shemitah, and we learned a lot more details. You know, it's really not that detailed in the Torah, but what it is radical. It sounds like very extreme, right? Like a total overthrowing of society as we know it. But the details, how do you make it work? The rabbis spent, you know, generations discussing, well, how would this actually work? And that's where a lot of the in my opinion, most beautiful ideas about Shemitah come out. Like, if you're not growing food, how is everybody going to be fed? The idea that as a community, you have to pull together and share the resources that you have. And they thought about all the details about how it would work. So I recommend, first of all, studying it more deeply, not just taking what's in the, you know, the verses in the Torah. To me, Shemitah is first and foremost a year devoted to sustainability. So when people ask me what is Shemitah, that's what I say. And the other big lesson that I take from the idea of Shemitah is that transformation is possible. The Torah presents this huge radical idea and says, yeah, you can change everything for a year. If it's important enough, you'll do it, you know? And I find that extremely inspiring, the idea that we can think big, we can think about really big changes. You know, I think we all struggle with, all of us who've been involved in this struggle with, well, how do we make it real in our lives? And I remember when we were looking forward to the 2014 Shemitah, which seems like a lifetime ago, honestly, right now. But I happened to go to Brooklyn to meet with Rabbi Val Lieber at the Kane Street Synagogue. And I was sitting there with her and we were talking about different environmental education programs and what they were going to do in the coming year with their green team and so on. And there was a volunteer, a member of the congregation sitting with us, and we started talking about the Shemitah year. And we were talking about, you know, what does it mean to, you know, stop the agricultural system and then have to share the food that's available. And we talked about that in different parts of the country, there are gleaning groups. I'm sure some of you are familiar, where people actually go out and map food resources, like, okay, maybe not in Maryland, but like in California, street trees, you know, that are producing fruit and so on. And think about like community members going out and collecting them and getting that food to people who need it. And this woman who was sitting there just happened to be, said, well, I have a fig tree in my backyard. And every summer I go away to the Hamptons and no one harvests the figs. And as I was sitting there, the two of them came up with this plan of how the community would go to this lady's backyard and they would collect the figs and they would take them to the local soup kitchen. And then the rabbi said, actually, there's also a fig tree in the backyard of the synagogue. It was an old church and that was a very big fig tree. And we climbed up the stairs to go look out the window and see that fig tree. And all of a sudden I saw that these ideas, they could be applied in our practical everyday life. I won't give all the examples I have because I know we're over time, but I do want to mention just one other one. Fred mentioned Einat Kramer, who runs Teva Ivri and is like a hero of mine and created really the whole Shemitah Israeli Shemitah project, the last Shemitah year. And one of the things that she came up with was the Shmita Tent. So they got a tent and they went all around Israel and put it up in different public places and had people just come and like enjoy being together, build community, talk about what Shemitah is and think about what they could do. And she told one story that really spoke to me. She said a guy came into the Shmita tent and he was learning about Shemitah and he's thinking, what can I do myself to observe the Shemitah? And he decided to release his parking space. You know, we talk about the release of the land, you know, he released his parking space. And he decided that he would commute by biking and walking for the Shemitah year. Maybe someone else could use that space. Maybe it would give the land a rest. Maybe it would give the atmosphere a rest. But he realized he could put it to work. He could put this concept into effect in his own life. So I encourage you to take the inspiration of Shemitah and think how you can put it into effect in your own life and the life of the community. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Caught a few of the chats. The question of, is this an aspiration or is it a prescription? Yes. Why 7th year? Why not? 7 is, of course, an archetypal number. It's the one number not in nature. Everything else follows a day or a month or a year. Those are all astronomical. 7 is made up. It's kind of in that sweet spot of long enough to get a lot done, but short enough to get a break when you need it. And the ancients had that wisdom, and Shabbat and sabbatical are of the very same root. Thank you so much, Mirala. Thank you all. We are in a couple minutes going to take a break, and you lucky people in person get a bunch of fair trade chocolate and other yummies to enjoy schmoozing with each other and working the land. So I actually want to ask Debbie, Fred, if you would come up real quick and just explain now what we're going to do. For everyone on Zoom, I want to thank you for being with us and remind you to tune in again in March and in May. May Omicron be come and gone by then, and we can all be in person. But for now, after this, we'll invite you to take a pause and return around 11:25 in 40 minutes, and we'll pick up for the 11:30 final session.
Yeah, just to pick up on some of the questions that were asked, to how you put this in practice and what we're going to show in the garden, and is this in other religions? The renewal of the land and the sustainable agriculture and environment, maybe, Jesse, it hasn't been as successful as it could be, but it is a very prevalent concept that is becoming more and more promoted in the news, but people who've worked in this area actually have been doing it for a while. And one thing, there has been a concept of just letting the land grow fallow, but there's also been a concept of rotating the crops when you have a knowledge of the botany of the crops and how they use the soil and which crops tend to, you know, have nitrogen fixation and which are heavy feeders drawing it out. And so the concept of renewing the soil is something we can be very conscious of in agriculture and in our own gardens and in all the gardens where I volunteer. And lots of cultures have been using this for a long time, whether it comes out of their religious texts. I'm not an expert in that, but there really are a lot of history for this and a lot of applications for it. And one of the things, we have a couple of projects I won't go into because so much of the audience is by Zoom instead of here, but we have a couple of projects to show this in our own garden. So I hope that answers some of the questions. The other thing, it was mentioned, I was asking Fred to remind me the word about it, the concept of gleaning has been used more and more around, even around here. A lot of the volunteers I work with go out to the fields and they take the leftover products that the farmers can't sell to Giant or Safeway or Whole Foods, where we all want to see the perfect pepper. And there are a handful of ways. One thing I've been looking into now, even now in this area, more and more, there are organizations like the one called Imperfect Foods. And you can order that misshapen pepper that the commercial farmer can't sell to the market because the average supermarket customer wants the perfect pepper. But the misshapen pepper is just as valuable as a food source. So there's a couple of thoughts I wanted to throw out.
Just really quick for those who aren't here, one of the things we'll look at outside is winter wheat, which we planted 3 or 4 weeks ago. It looks a lot like grass, but there's certain beds that are up to about here. And as Debbie said, that's a way to turn and enrich the soil in the spring. But if you want to keep it growing up until June, we'll have a small wheat field in the Mishnah garden. And we did this a long time ago. We're gonna use a coffee grinder and we're gonna go through all the little red hen steps, and we'll hopefully end up with a cup of flour that we can make into a challah that will be served on the bima. We did this a while ago and we'll see if it works again.
So even small scale, even in our Mishnah garden, even in our own home gardens, those who have, they can be a big part of this sustainable food source approach. And if you just think about how far backyard gardening has come since it dropped, it was huge in World War II, victory gardens, then it became sort of a marginal activity and it's back. And what a difference that makes. And think about that from an economic standpoint, from a climate standpoint, from a spiritual, our relationship with the land. It is an example of Shmita consciousness. And the volunteers who keep the Mishnah garden and sacred grounds going are living out Shmita consciousness all 7 years. So we are going to work the land on the 7th year. We're not taking it literally in that way, but we're doing so precisely as an extension of Shmita values across the 7-year cycle. So with that, and with appreciation, make sure to stop by Mirala's station also, a letter writing opportunity, because we don't want to miss advocacy as it pertains to trying to bring Shmita consciousness into our collective sphere. And Mirala will have more details on that. Thank you, Debbie and Fred. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Cheryl, Colin, our Zoom gabbai. And on Zoom, come back in 37 minutes. Blessings all. Okay, welcome back everyone, and a tremendous thank you to Cheryl Collin, who did more than we knew, or more than we in the room knew, because there was no sound, so I couldn't hear her, and when I was screen sharing, I couldn't see the chat to realize that the slides were advancing here, but not for you on Zoom, and I hugely apologize. Cheryl Collin, thank you so much for pulling it up and following along, so everyone could see and read and learn together. We think we've rectified the problem, and here's praying. So welcome back. We have a new cast of characters. The garden is amazing. The compost is amazing. Huge thanks to Fred Pinkney and Debbie Siegel and the entire team of Mishnah Garden volunteers, Lise Kaplan and so many others. There's amazing stuff happening over the winter. And if you happen to be in the neighborhood, there's a lot of kale and it's still looking good and you can snip it yourself. So good stuff all around. In the overview this morning, We looked at 4 of the 5 Torah portions where Shemitah comes up, but we held off the last one, Deuteronomy 31, almost the very end of Torah, for the idea of Hakel, which is where community and spirituality come in. But the larger themes of resilience have already been well established. This is about being ready for anything. If you follow Shmita Consciousness, things stay small scale. If you follow Shmita Consciousness, neighbors know and are in touch with each other because every 7th year, things are shared. There's even the pieces that we talked about 7 years ago, the idea of cross-training, of what does it mean to be a generalist, that maybe this age of specialization where we become expert in our little things and expect that there's an entire global economy so that someone else makes the microchips and someone else makes the solar panels and all I do is this particular kind of work, and somehow it all holds together. Even the assumption that the supply chains are constant has been tested by COVID. And the idea that we need our own gardens, that we need to think small, we need to be in touch with our neighbors. That is Shmita consciousness. It is also, in a certain way, COVID consciousness, being ready for anything. That is resilience at the macro level. And there's a lot of talk in the climate community with the professionals of municipalities and others who do climate adaptation, as it's called, right? Mitigation is let's minimize our carbon and methane output and think about land use and diet and everything else and simply try to slow global warming. But it's already happening. And so we also need to adapt. Wealthier communities can adapt more easily. Poorer communities, obviously not. This is a huge global inequity. But this concept of resilience is at the heart of adaptation. It is at the heart of the climate conversation. What does it mean to be a resilient city or county or state or country or neighborhood or block or home? So both at the micro and at the macro level. Resilience is, we could spend an entire session, and if we had more to do, we would, on just resilient cities. We have professionals in this community who do that work. And could bring some amazing perspectives. We wanted to open in a somewhat more inward direction, not so much going out, although those questions loom, but coming deeper inside. So a quick scan through this last category of texts and relevances. This we think is the best that we can do, where it's covering like 70% of the screen. Yes, we can see, even though we see the stuff around it. And we will work on the settings by March 19th, the next time that we do this, I promise. So personal renewal and release. So again, the pandemic overlap. There was a piece in the On Parenting from the Post that the pandemic has caused parents to slow down, and that's not a bad thing. Here's how to preserve that pace. Some of the examples: create a list of the pros and cons, a reference point, because it changes so quickly. And I say that as new changes, of course, loom. Establish boundaries, be clear about what you will and won't do when. That is also called Sabbath keeping, right? We have that on a weekly basis, that boundary, and Shemitah is the consciousness of putting that across years as well. Make a slow choice. Just take one area, meals or conversation with a particular beloved, and be conscious of it. Even set up reminders. I love this. Put an annual reminder in your to-do app now for August 1st, right? When you're about to hit the program year and the professionals have the conversations about what we're going to put on the calendar, right? Do not schedule extra stuff in September. I didn't make that one up. And schedule do nothing time. That is also called Shemitah. Some of us know April or Aviva Baskin, a leader in the Jewish community, and on her racial justice and living a meaningful life blog and podcast just a few weeks ago, she wrote, that's the thing about Shemitah. The obligation is not to release what's easy to release. The spirit of Shemitah is to release even when release is hard. Right? We don't need this to talk about the stuff that we do already, where we already have the resources, the willpower, the expectation, and we make it happen. This is about what needs a push, where we need to go further. So mindfully living into a kavanah or an intention for this Shemitah year, it's not too late to think about what is the intention that you will live into. And hers happens to be very powerful about mixed racial and ethnic and religious background. But the larger question, what protections or patterns of behavior are you holding on to that are holding you back? Shemitah literally means release, radical release. That's not just about land ownership. That's not just about debts. That's not just about living a sustainable life in the ecosystem. That is also about living a sustainable life within. What could you courageously release that would help move you toward your own and our collective liberation? I want to read that again. Thank you, April Baskin. What could you courageously release that would help move you toward your own and our collective liberation? Rav Kook wrote a lot about this, even though he was concerned with the minutiae of the specifics for the return to Zion farmers in 1909. Life can only be perfected through the affording of a breathing space from the bustle of everyday life. Perfected, he doesn't mean make it perfect, he means be on the road toward that. We shake our free from ordinary weekday life at short and regular intervals, Shabbat, and what Shabbat achieves regarding the individual, Shemitah achieves with regard to the nation as a whole. A year of solemn rest is essential for nation and land, a year of equality and rest, and now it gets personal, in which the soul reaches out toward divine justice, toward God. There is no private property, no punctilious privilege. The peace of God reigns over all. And look on the right-hand side here. The distancing from the hustle and bustle of daily life also permeates the morality of individuals like poison. Rather, this means that the distancing from our essential selves that is part of the hustle and bustle is like poison. Stilling the tumult of social life from time to time in certain predictable ways is meant to move a well-ordered nation to rise toward an encounter with the heights of its inner moral and spiritual life. This is for our inner moral and spiritual life. And this is the text. The last time it comes up, Hakel, it says, Miketz Sheva Shanim, at the end of every 7th year, and it's a debate, does that actually mean at the end of that year, or does it mean this is the end of a cycle of 7, but it's during that Shemitah, so it would be like the beginning of it, right? B'moed Shnata Shemitah, at the gathering, the physical gathering for the year of Shemitah at Chag HaSukkot, because there's no pilgrimage festival on Rosh Hashanah when the year starts, but 2 weeks later for Sukkot there is. And when all Israel comes to appear before God, read this teaching aloud in the presence of all Israel. Hakel et ha'am, gather the people, all the people, explicitly including women and children, which Torah doesn't often do, and specifically calling out strangers, right? Those with green card, those who are not yet fully enfranchised in this system, but if they live in your land, they count. Gather the people, hakel et ha'am, that they may hear and learn and revere and observe, and let their children too have that experience. Ibn Ezra in the 12th century is very clear that means Torah study. He thinks that you do this at the beginning of the Shemitah year. Why would they do this? Why would the Jewish people begin Shemitah year by reading the Torah out loud in front of the whole community, including women and children? Lama'an yishma'u, right? In order that they will hear and learn and observe. Shemitah was ushered in through Torah study. And Kol HaShanah, do it all year. The purpose of Shemitah was the suspension of work to facilitate the study of Torah. For Ibn Ezra, there's nothing better to do in one's free time than study Torah. I think for some of us, that's true too. But that's not the only thing we do with our free time. And it better not all be Netflix and video games either, right? This is about all of our pursuits. Rabbi Arthur Waskow, more than maybe anyone, brought this to light even before the last couple Shemitah cycles, and wrote, we need Sabbath, acceptance of mystery, celebration of mystery over mastery. Love that, right? And this doesn't mean cursing our workaday. It means putting it in its proper place within a Sabbath framework. And he doesn't mean the literal Sabbath of seventh day, nor just the extendeds like the 7th year and the 50th year, a whole approach of mind and practice, a path of life to affirm the worth of dawdling on the path. So with that, we are thrilled to have 3 expert perspectives on what this looks like. This inaugurates what we'll be doing in March and in May, where people bring their professional expertise to these questions. The Shemitah hook is resilience. The Shemitah hook is spirituality. How that plays out, how we deepen it, this is Shmita Consciousness. And we are thrilled to start with Beth Sperber-Ritchie. Down button to advance.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. I'm just loving this Arthur Waskow quote. It could not be more. I'm going to obviously have to steal this and use this in other things I'm doing, but the affirming the worth of dawdling on the path. So before I get into the specifics about building resilience, I wanted to just take a second to talk about releasing productivity. There is forget about the, economic evaluation of releasing productivity and not feeding into the capitalist system, et cetera, et cetera. We'll set that aside just for a minute, but just in terms of individuals. The research that's out there on productivity and how actually we can increase productivity by taking breaks, by dawdling on the path, is pretty solid. And it goes in all sorts of different directions. Sherry Ma out at Stanford did this with basketball players at Stanford who spent more time actually getting rest and sleep, increased their free throw percentages, and they did. Ernst & Young did research that said that people who take their vacations not only are less likely to leave the organization, but they are also more likely to be evaluated higher by their supervisors. The research is just, there's so much out there. The person who I point to often the most is Anders Ericsson, who's at FSU, Florida State, who did research on the value of working in 90-minute increments in the same way that we have sleep cycles of 90 minutes all night long. We actually, in terms of brain waves, wake up every 90 minutes, which some of us are conscious of and some of us are less conscious of. You may not realize, but that actually happens. But the same is true during your day. And Ericsson looked at people across a whole bunch of different career fields, elite performers, and in all of the cases, found that people who worked intensively in 90-minute cycles and then took breaks actually showed greater productivity in, as I said, a whole variety of career fields. So the idea of releasing productivity, or at least releasing the idea that we have to be productive all the time and that we shouldn't take breaks, my socialist son would say, the capitalist analysis says we should release productivity completely, but since we're not likely to do that, what we should at least do is release the idea of needing to be productive all the time, because renewing and slowing down and taking breaks and taking time to dawdle on the path is really actually a way to increase our productivity. And obviously the same is true for the land, right? Part of the reason for the Shemitah year is give the land a break so that it can be more productive. So it's the same thing for us. Having said that, what we're talking about today, or what Rabbi Fred asked if I would speak a little bit about, is sort of the building blocks and the foundations of individual resilience from a more psychological perspective. I did this work a couple of decades ago, actually, when I was working as a trauma consultant to an organization called the Landmine Survivors Network. And so I have to give a shout out to the Landmine Survivors Network folks, and also the CDC for supporting the research that went into this. We looked at limb loss survivors in countries all around the world and the United States, and we did a qualitative research that landed us on these 6 factors in terms of having the most impact on building resilience in limb loss survivors. So I'm going to talk in more detail about how this applies to us now, but the pieces that were there, I think are important to look at, because who better to look at, I always say, in terms of building resilience than trauma survivors. Partially that's because that's what I do for a living, and I'm focused on trauma survivors in general, but also, you know, if you've bounced back from and maybe even developed some post-traumatic growth, you seem like somebody who I would want to turn to figure out what in fact builds resilience. So there are individual level variables. We'll talk a little bit more about that in more detail. Treatment, really important for limb loss survivors, not surprisingly. For the rest of us, I would just, you know, think of that as sort of taking care of our physical selves, and we'll talk more about that. Family, social support, not shockingly, emotional support from friends, other amputees. We did a lot of work on developing peer-to-peer networks with this group of folks, and community, sense of community, which hopefully many of us get here. Obviously, economic situation for a lot of our limb loss survivors. They were farmers in countries where there were not a lot of other activities going on. And so, you know, if you step on a landmine, you lose a number of limbs, a lot harder to do that. So obviously the economic necessities, we're talking about sort of the basic, you know, food and shelter. And then society, that the socio and political context actually made a huge difference in terms of people's response to limb loss in cultures around the world, where if you're an amputee, you walk into a, you know, store, you're going to be followed around the store in the same way that people of color complain about that in our country. Amputees get that in cultures all around the world, because the expectation is you don't have a way of making money, so you're definitely going to steal something. So, you know, one of my good friends and colleagues from that landmine work talked about being in Cambodia, where he was helping to develop a landmine survivors network there. And he's an amputee. And he said, I got followed everywhere I went. Did not matter where I went. Did not matter that, you know, he was clearly a white guy from the United States and probably has more money than the average Cambodian, blah, blah, blah. Didn't matter. He's an amputee. He's definitely going to be expected to steal. So an interesting population to work with, and a really great way to, I think, get a sort of first glance at resilience. So having said that, the work that I do here is more focused on how we build resilience. You know, obviously we're looking at landmine survivors around the world. That's not the average experience of the average American, although there are a lot of amputees in the United States. But the way it applies to us and to us in this context is to sort of take that research about, here are these folks who are dealing with, I would say, one of the harder things that life throws your way, and how do we apply that in our own lives? I put this in actually out of order. I'm going to put this up first, and then I'll go back to that other slide. Audre Lorde is sort of my the goddess for me of looking at this particular issue of self-care, because I think the idea that we have is, I always like to say self-care is not a bath bomb, right? Like, this is not, self-care is not just about, you know, doing something that we would think of as something only available to people with economic privilege, going to the spa, getting a massage, laying in the tub, you know, what all of those things that we think of. That's not what we're talking about here. I mean, Audre Lorde was talking about it as a person who was in multiply marginalized communities. So she was talking about it as an act of self-preservation, because the larger society doesn't actually want people of color and people who are queer or people who are coming from other marginalized groups to take care of themselves. So it's actually a bit of an act of political warfare to say, I am going to take care of myself. But I put her there because I always feel like, especially at a place like Adat Shalom, part of the reason I come to services regularly for spiritual renewal, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But part of the reason I come, and part of the reason I like to be in this community, is that I know when I look around this room, and I don't know who's on the Zoom, but when I know if I were looking at you all, I'm connected through this community to people who are doing good in the world. These are people who are trying, you all are folks who are trying to make the world a better place. And so for me, it's the same thing. That self-care, that individualized focus is to sustain you to do the stuff that you're doing that is larger focused, right? Like, you know, there's not a lot of people that I've met at a Dutch Loan who are only looking after themselves and their family. So I see it as an act of political warfare because it's saying, I'm going to take care of myself in a way that allows me to go out and change the world. Having said that, my goal, and we don't have time enough to do this right now, but I'm the daughter of educators and the granddaughter of educators and the mother of an educator and the sister of educators, and education is family business. So I'm going to give you homework because that's what people in my family do. I'm going to, in the slides, which I'm assuming can go out in the world, and also a shortened version of it in the source sheet. I want you to go out and actually spend some time developing a plan that's going to work for you to reduce your burnout and keep you going so that you can do the important work that you're doing. First thing is awareness. It's always awareness. You have to be aware that you are, in fact, pushing yourself beyond the pale and beyond your limits, and really important to recognize that first. Then to identify some of your unhealthy habits in a variety of areas. Those 6 that are listed: interpersonal, physical, emotional, spiritual, cognitive, and financial, are the ones that I pulled from those 6 in the study with landmine survivors. Really important to take a moment, and you can do this now. I think I have a minute to do this, to just sort of take a deep breath and think for just a moment about a time in your life where you had to do something that was really, really hard, and that you faced something really, really hard. It may have been in the last 20 months, right? The pandemic has brought up all sorts of really hard things. But we all have that moment or those moments in our lives where we face something really difficult. So just think about that for a moment and picture yourself at that time when you were facing one of the harder things that you've had to face. And think about what you drew on in that moment. So there was something that allowed you, hopefully, to get out of bed and go deal directly with what that issue was. What were the personal strengths you relied on? Who were the people in your life who stepped up, who were there for you? How did you use the resources of the larger community? Whether those are healthcare resources or emotional support or whatever it is that you look to. I mean, you've got that short list in your mind. I want you to think about what you were like at that time when you were your most resilient self. So there's a moment for each of us, many moments when we're fighting something really hard or dealing with something really difficult, where we are our least and weakest, and the self that we need the most from the people around us. And there's also those moments in those hard times where we are our most resilient self. And I want you to focus in on that version of you, because that version of you can come to deal with whatever it is that's going to come next. So with that picture in mind, I'm going to point you in the direction of 2 things. One that's on the screen and in your packet, which is a way to sort of develop a plan for going forward, how you can take the best care of yourself and build the most internal resilience. Looking at what your healthy practices are and your unhealthy practices, and then figuring out where are you going to make change in each of those areas. And in addition to where are you going to make change, who are you going to tell about it? Because we know accountability helps in terms of people making change. And then a little reminder that those goals should be SMART goals: specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, time-based. You all have seen that before. Don't just say, I'm going to increase meditation. Write down, I'm going to increase meditation by meditating this many times a week. I'm going to do something physical. I'm going to go to shul more frequently. I'm going to reach out to another member of my community here or in any of the other communities that you're a part of. Put those things in your calendar. Give yourself specific, measurable, achievable goals, and that's the way to build resilience. So I think now I'm turning over to you, David.
Should be the next slide.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Beth
Ritchie, who also sings and davens. And what a beautiful thing to be able to bring that the social, political analysis, the personal, and the spiritual all fused together. Thank you so much. David Kirsch, likewise, Adat Shalomer, University of Maryland professor, practitioner, theorist, and awesome guy, to help think through both how personal resilience works and also keep it connected to that larger ecological context in which Shemitah unfolds. Thank you, Fred. I feel like, what's the saying, a longtime listener, first time caller, up here sharing with you, and it's wonderful to be with you. And you said these are professional reflections, I should say. In my case, this really is a set of personal reflections coming out of some personal experience that I'll talk about, and I guess maybe my family's professional background, but not mine. It's with some hesitancy that I make comments about the psychological. Maybe this is kind of a footnote in some ways for Beth's comment. I was experiencing burnout. I really was, and I think many of us may have had various kind of feelings of burnout around over the last 22 months, and experienced that in different ways. And one of the ways I experienced that was through this experience of solastalgia, which I'll talk about here in a moment. And what I thought maybe I would just invite people to do first is kind of take a moment and think of a place or places where you have felt comforted and from which you have derived strength and meaning. So, I have some examples here: childhood home, vacation spot, a historic site, someplace that was spiritually comforting to you, from which you derived a sense of solace. And maybe try to be as specific as possible. Really, in your mind, put yourself in that place. And if on Zoom, if you feel comfortable, you could share it. If you're in the sanctuary, if you want to maybe even mention it to the person next to you or kind of give voice to it, that would also be fine. The thinking here is really think about the places that have brought you comfort. And I'll just share a picture. I'm not sure if everyone can see it, but this was a place where I had great comfort. This is a picture of Fallen Leaf Lake, which is this little lake off of Lake Tahoe. Actually, I've sat exactly where that picture is taken. I didn't take it right on the little boat dock there. And I just share it with you. This was actually a place I first visited more than 50 years ago with my family. This is it's about a 3-inch tall trophy that my mother gave me when, as a 7-year-old, I managed to hike 1.5 miles up the hill from Fallen Leaf Lake to this little cathedral lake. And, she understood incentives and said, you'll get a reward if you complete this. So this little trophy sits at that picture I took just yesterday. It's on my desk at home. It's one of the things I cherish. And that this is a place that my family and I have gone back to, on and off ever since. It's that I can smell the vanilla in the bark of the trees and feel the crunch of the pine needles underfoot as we climb away from the lake. So it has this very deep personal resonance. It was someplace I was thinking about a lot when we were locked up last year, and was very, very present for me. And so last summer, again, 16 months after the pandemic, my daughter and I chose to. It was my first conference away from home. We went, and my daughter accompanied me, and we were going to go visit Fallen Leaf Lake and walk in the mountains, experience that. And what did we encounter? Of course, the Calvert fire, and it shut the entire area. And I don't want pictures of literally the smoke kind of rolling across Lake Tahoe. The entire area was closed, and this was so painful. It's I experienced this really very powerfully, and over the course of a few weeks and some conversations with my stepmother, a very thoughtful Jungian analyst, she helped me and introduced me to this concept of solastalgia. And it's a psychoterratic disorder, so-called, associated with, and again, people may have recognized this in themselves in some way, the idea of nature deficit disorder, eco-anxiety, global dread. Solastalgia is the label that I was able to attach to this feeling. And these scholars who have studied this define it as the pain or sickness caused by the loss or lack of solace and the sense of isolation connected to the present state of one's home and territory. It's the lived experience of the loss of the present as manifest in a feeling of dislocation, of being undermined by forces that destroy the potential for solace to be derived from the present, a form of homesickness one gets when one is still at home. So this, my message is a simple one. As soon as I had this label for this thing, as soon as I could put a name on it, suddenly it helped me realize, this is something that I'm experiencing. And so I wanted to share it with us today to think, others of you may also be experiencing something like this, of imagining that place where you should feel comforted, where you should feel solace, but not. And then having that, kind of compound the feeling of burnout, of struggle, of dislocation. And so I want to just give you a word for it. There's a word for it, and having a word for it, now maybe there's something we can do about it. And so that the other definitions or other kind of comments on solastalgia below, right? It can also be future oriented, as those who suffer from it might actively seek to create new things or engage in collective action that provides solace and communion in any given environment, wherever we are. And it may seek its alleviation in a future that has to be designed and created. These are, it falls back to us. It's not something we just find in the world, but something we make. And so I wanted to close just with this idea of re-enchantment. And I think my thought here is we need to obviously acknowledge our own role in undermining the power of place to provide comfort. Flying to California, to this place, is making the problem worse, is making that fire, is feeding that fire. And we need to seek some new pathways to solace, including but not limited to new places. And obviously this is something, Rabbi Fred took us on that wonderful walk through Rock Creek Park, which for me has been an enchanted place during the pandemic. And in a sense, the trip there for me was seeking planet B, right, on some level. And what I realized is
we have to embrace Planet B. We're on it, we're here. And we have to own it and make sure we do our best to enchant it. So thank you. What was that? Oh, sure, yeah, so the mask, I actually mentioned this to Rabbi Rachel as we were coming in. So as a professor, I spend a lot of time in front of students speaking, and it's a mask called Airgami, A-I-R, so origami, but start with air. You have to measure your face to get the right size, but it does create a lot of space in front of you, so you can have the mask on and feel a little less muffled. So by all means, Airgami away. Sweet, thank you. All right, 22 months into this and we're still learning new tips. That is great. Many of us know Planet B from the saying in the climate community, there is no Planet B, right? So we need to be on Plan and Planet A, and Plan A has to be quick carbon mitigation and adaptation. But this is a beautiful way of reframing that as we re-enchant, we make it Planet B on the only Planet A that we have. Thank you so very much. Wow. All right. Rabbi Rachel and I take turns up here all the time. It is always wonderful to be able to share, especially when one of us starts with some like pet project of ours and the other kind of picks it up along the way. I have learned so much from her over the years, and hopefully my Shemitah fixation is rubbing off a bit on her and all of you.
Thank you. So could I actually turn this sharing off just for
yes,
for a couple of minutes?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, folks. Good midday. Glad to be with you all. I would like to share some specific practices that have become really important to me over many years, but especially during the pandemic, and which I think have a special resonance as we come into this Shemitah year, as we're already in this Shemitah year and are looking to connect ourselves with some of the principles that guided the original establishment of the Shemitah laws. I was talking with Mirala last night, and I was saying to her, you know, the problem with Shemitah is it's so abstract. It's like, what are you supposed to do with this? And Mirala, of course, is there everything okay over there? Okay. Showed me quickly that it's actually very concrete, and there is a number of very practical practices that have been associated with it over many generations. So I just want to share two things with you that have been especially nourishing for me, not just connected with Shemitah, but I think, and I'll hopefully show you, ultimately connected with Shemitah. So the first, it would really be great if we could take off our shoes, if people are comfortable doing that. I'm going to take mine off. Right. We're standing on holy ground. Many of you may know that I have become a real devotee of Hatha Yoga over a couple decades now, and continue to be just completely inspired by what it has to teach us. I feel like this is one area that Jewish life has a little bit of a blind spot. I think that on some level, when we lost our land, we lost our connection, not only with land, but with our bodies, with the concrete level of physical experience, which is one of the things that I think Shemitah is trying to point us back to. Not in the way of, you know, how much muscle can you build, but in the way of being embodied, being aware of our bodies. So apropos of that, I'd like to just ask you to practice one yoga pose with me. And that is, it's in the Sanskrit, it's called Tadasana, which means mountain pose. It's best done standing, but if standing isn't reasonable, you can do it. You can follow this sitting. If you're going to be seated, sit on the edge of your chair if you're able to, or if you're able to stand, that's even better. So first look down and bring your feet to parallel with one another, and bring your feet hip distance apart. So you have a stable base to stand on, and your feet are pointing parallel to one another. And as I always like to say in practicing yoga, it's fine to look down, but remember to look up again. Bring your face back up to upright, and your face is now perpendicular with the floor. Now, lift your toes up just a little bit and press the balls of your feet into the floor and the heels into the floor. And now see if you can reach the baby toe far away from the other toes. Stretch the toes wide to help you open the bones of the feet, and then gently lay the toes back down. No gripping in the toes, just gently lay them down. And continue to press the balls and the heels into the floor. The arches of your feet will rise naturally on their own. Now, maintain that awareness as if you've got your mind's eye right in your feet. Keep pressing the feet down. And now bring your mind's eye to your kneecaps. Draw the kneecaps into the center of the knee, in towards the back of the knee. So firm in the legs, strong and tall in the legs, and we build that by establishing this balance in the kneecaps. Kneecaps are coming in again towards the backs of the knee, as if you've got windows at the backs of the knees that are opening more and more. And as you maintain now the firmness of the feet, the strong balance in the kneecaps, bring your mind's eye to your quadricep muscles, those muscles that are at the front of your thighs, and draw the quadriceps firmly against the thigh bone, as if you could move the thigh bones to the back of the thighs. And now you're standing on the most stable base. As you continue to charge the feet into the floor, continue to be firm in the kneecaps, firm in the quadriceps. Now bring your mind's eye to your pelvis, especially to the back of the pelvis, which we so refer to as the sacrum, the space between your back waist and the bottom of your spine, and draw that down. So the bottom of the spine is reaching down towards the arches of the feet, the sacrum lengthening, drawing down, descending down as the front of the pelvis now begins to lift. So from the bottom of the torso, the front of the body is lifting up, ascending towards the head, and the back of the body is descending down towards the heels. Extend your arms straight. Hands are facing, palms facing in towards the outer hips. And be strong now through the arms as well. So there's energy going all the way through your arms, through your fingertips. Your hands are part of the pose as well. And now with all this stability below you, continue lifting the front body. The chest lifting up, sternum lifting up. Take your shoulders back. Draw them back, and shoulder blades down towards the back waist. And now bring your mind's eye to your head. And if your eyes are closed, go ahead and open your eyes and see if you can look forward from the depth of your vision. So you're able to see a very wide peripheral view, not just what's right in front of you, but all around. Maintain this poise while you continue to breathe freely. As you stay in this mountain pose, notice the places where you may feel numb. If you feel numb, bring some oxygen to those places. Notice especially in the foundation of the pose, your feet, your knees, your thighs. Can you re-energize those connections? And then as you're ready, release. Staying poised in your mind and quiet in your mind. Come back to your comfortable place, seated or standing. So just a taste of taking some time, perhaps each day, to be embodied as much as possible. Most of us in our sector of society live lives that want to exercise our minds strongly and don't give us as much space or much encouragement to be body conscious, although we have to live in these bodies 24/7. So taking a moment to open our awareness of our physical form is an important part of this whole rebalancing and reconnecting that we're seeking during Shemitah, but I think all the time. So I was talking with Rabbi Fred this week, and he's just reminding me, like, this is about cultivating Shmita Consciousness, not just during this one year, but all the time. Okay, so the second of the two things that I wanted to share with you is about tefillah, about prayer, and specifically about morning prayer. And I brought, this is my childhood siddur. It says Siddur Shiloh. That was just the name of the publication. I think this was from Kita Gimel, 3rd grade. And my parents unearthed it a number of years ago in some cleaning they were doing. And so I've been enjoying using it for the last many years for my own morning prayer at home. Some of you may know that there's a structure to the morning prayers that tells us you have to have a minyan, you have to have 10 for certain prayers. So I don't have a minyan in my house. So most of the time when I'm praying on my own, I'm not saying the more common prayers that we know when we're in shul together, because those are the ones you can say when you have a minyan. But my attention has landed on two things that have become especially important to me over the last bunch of years. One of them I want to walk you through on this PowerPoint that Fred very helpfully created for us. But before I do that, I just want to mention another that's in this traditional siddur. It's not in actually most siddurim that I've seen more recently. But it's part of the morning liturgy that is specifically asking us to balance the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov. And I just want to pause for a moment and say something about this. So probably people in this gathering this morning are familiar with these terms, Yetzer Hara and Yetzer Tov, but just to get us into a working definition together. Yetzer Hara is often defined as the evil impulse, sort of classically the evil impulse, and Yetzer Tov, the impulse towards good. And this is sort of very much a binary, which of course is, like most binaries, a false binary. But in the rabbinic mind, each of us has a Yetzer Hara within us. And I was especially appreciative of the definition I learned from Rabbi Ira Stone, so one of our great teachers of Musar, who says he thinks of the Yetzer Hara as the impulse towards serving the self. The impulse, not selfishness necessarily, but serving the self. And in that way, it's extremely important for us. We need the Yetzer Hara, as our tradition teaches us, in order to live in this physical world. We need it to motivate us to develop careers, to build homes, to give birth to children, to want to acquire so that we can sustain ourselves. And the challenge, the problem is that the Yetzer Hara quickly becomes a way overdeveloped muscle. So what is the boundary point between making sure we have enough to live well and live comfortably and live sustainably, and when does that tip over into I really don't need all of this that I've begun to acquire, but I happen to live in a socioeconomic framework, kind of pure capitalism, if I could say it that way, that encourages that. There aren't a lot of safeguards or a lot of breaks in that system. So prayer turns out to be an interesting one. In this morning passage, this is very short, I just want to read it to you. It says, V'hi ratzon milfanecha, may it be your will. Adonai Eloheinu ve'Elohei Avotenu, and I would add Imotenu. Adonai, who is the same God that our ancestors were constantly seeking. Shetargilenu b'Toratecha, to guide us in regular relationship with Torah text. V'dabkenu b'mitzvotecha, and make us cleave to the mitzvot, make us pay attention to the structure of righteous living. V'al tivienu lo lidei chet, don't bring us always to the verge of transgression, which is such a human condition. And just one last phrase here. I'm going to skip ahead. Va'al tashlet banu yetzer hara. Don't let us come under the control of the yetzer hara, which is an acknowledgement that it's always has to be part of our daily lives, but don't let it control us, which is to me one of the central messages of Shmita consciousness. To be aware, if you accept Rabbi Ira Stone's definition that Yetzer Hara is the impulse to serve the self, Shmita is all about helping us to stay tuned in with our mandate to serve others. And I'm so mindful of Beth and David's teachings just before this about don't pump it too hard, and look for the ways that you're maybe over serving. And there are probably people in this community who are really susceptible to that. So maybe you guys don't need to be such a lesson about cultivating the Yetzer Tov, but the rest of us, myself included certainly, want to make sure that we're constantly in our prayers, using our prayers to help us balance the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov. Not to let us come under control of the Yetzer Hara, which is so easy to do. I could think of many examples in my own life where there it is. So now finally to go to the passage that's in this packet, which is a passage from the Jerusalem Talmud. It's included in the prayer service. So it's a passage from Talmud that gets included as liturgy. It doesn't have the same liturgical formulas that we're used to. It doesn't say Baruch Atah. There's no God in it, actually, ironically, but there are a whole bunch of behaviors that it's asking us to pay attention to. And so I'd like to walk you through this briefly. The Jerusalem Talmud, so it's just interesting to pause for a minute and be aware. The Jerusalem Talmud is the smaller of the two Talmuds, but in fact was developed and canonized in the land. That's why it's called the Jerusalem Talmud. So it's written, compiled by rabbinic sages who had not been stripped of the ability to fulfill Shemitah. They were still living in a place where it could be fulfilled. But I'm mentioning this because I think this is exactly the kind of passage that our tradition came up with to figure out, well, what do you do when you can't really uphold Shemitah where you live? So here instead are a bunch of things that you can pay attention to and make sure that you're doing. So first we begin, Elu devarim she'en lehem shiur. These are the things that you can't do too much of them. Peah, bikurim, harayon, gemilut chasadim, v'talmud Torah. So let's see. Those are peah, meaning leaving the corners of your field unharvested so that those who don't have enough will at least have those leftovers that you don't need. So that's an important, right away, we're in Shmita consciousness right there. So peah is number one. Bikurim, offering first fruits in the temple service. So having a relationship with your produce, that it's not just for you, it's also to serve the source of life. Harayon, it's translated here as the appearance offering, showing up. In this case, they're referring to the 3 pilgrimage festivals, showing up at the temple, presenting yourself, being part of the community, and offering yourself in sacred service. Gemilut chasadim, acts of loving kindness, which is a category of its own. and some of those are going to get distilled down below. And finally, Talmud Torah, the study of Torah. And I'm drawn back to, Fred, what you were showing us before from not Rav Kook, Ibn Ezra, about Shemitah being a season where we are supposed to withdraw a little bit from life. What's the priority there? To study Torah. Then the text goes on to say, Elu divarim she'adam ochel peroteim ba'olam hazeh. These are the things that we can taste the fruits of them in this life. Va'keren kayemet la'olam haba, but they only reach their full kiyum. They only reach their full, establishment in a realm that we can't perceive yet. So we do them not only for the gifts that they bring us now, but in the belief that they're somehow going to have some impact in a future realm. And here they are. These are the things. Kibud av va'em, honoring our parents, honoring them in life and honoring their memory. And I always have to wonder, are these in priority order? And if so, why is this one first? Is it because it's not always the easiest? Gemilut chasadim, which is again that phrase that means acts of loving kindness, but often we understand meaning to refer to a specific list of things, which I think we're going to hear in just a moment. Gemilut chasadim. Hashkamat Beit HaMidrash Shacharit ve'Arvit, being connected to the house of study in mornings and evenings. Hachnasat Orchim, welcoming guests, which of course is a little complicated during a pandemic season. So we have to be creative about how we're going to do it and stay connected with those who don't have sufficient hospitality. Bikur Cholim, visiting the sick, also somewhat take some creativity during a pandemic to figure out how to fulfill that one, but through the magic of technology, we are able to. Hachnasat Kala, which means, I guess literally you would translate that as entering the bride or sort of pushing the bride forward, something like that. But as Noah Baum said to me recently, we were talking about this, and she said, it means being actively engaged in matchmaking, paying attention to the establishment of loving relationships and supporting them. And as I would say, as a Jewish community, we have to do that for all different kinds of relationships. Levayat Hamet, accompanying the dead, is one of the greatest mitzvot in our tradition, of course, because it can never be repaid. There's no reciprocal reward. It's just what you do for the person who has died. Iyun Tefillah, which is what we're doing right now, trying to unpack the meaning of prayer so that we can understand what it's trying to say to us and ask for us. And then, I don't know if these are in ascending order, perhaps this is the most important one. Hava'at Shalom Ben Adam Lechavero. In every task of our life, looking for how we can bring peace between people, searching for how to break down tensions and break down hostilities. And it ends by saying the study of Torah is equal to them all. I think Fred helpfully added here, we understand it's equal to them all because hopefully it leads to them all. It's not equal to them all because we're meant to just sit and study all day, but that if we study, it'll help us to live this life of mitzvot, which again, I'm bringing up here because I hear it so much in resonance with the exploration we're trying to make and the seeking we're trying to make about Shmita consciousness, which is a kind of leveling of that Yetzer Tov, Yetzer Hara struggle. If we're engaged in what I understand mostly from Rabbi Fred about Shmita consciousness, is to tame the Yetzer Hara, to say, actually, you have enough. I say to myself, you have enough. Here is where your energy should be now. And I would add Beth, and I think something about David's teaching that do all of these things and also take care of yourself. Thank you. Put my shoes back on.
Thank you.
So the next text is actually going to suggest that Shmita consciousness is Torah consciousness. So yes, it's about making sure that we serve society and serve the other, that we think about the long term. But Shemitah consciousness is also about restfulness. It's also about prioritizing the self and lifting up the spirit. Every one of these breakdowns about the implications for reparations and racial justice, about climate consciousness and the need to mitigate and adapt, but also the need to take care of ourselves, the Audre Lorde approach. And also the need to have our Lake Tahoe moments, right? And also the need to make sure that there are fewer forest fires in the future so that we can get through. So it is all Shmita consciousness. And we're just wrapping up here. And the 2 slides from now, we'll get to the reminder of upcoming events. But this is the last piece of text to offer. This is from an ancient text contemporaneous with the Gemara, with the latter part of the Talmud, called the Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael. And it's asking about what we actually affirmed at Sinai and what Moses would actually say at that 7th year gathering, when it said, gather the people and share this Torah. And the obvious is, well, they can't mean the entire Torah from Genesis 1 to Deuteronomy 34. People would faint of hunger and thirst before they get to Exodus, right? So what is it? Rabbi Yishmael asked, from where did Moshe begin to read? If you have to summarize Torah and recovenant, what is the essence of Torah that you put forward to the people? And the answer is, when you settle the land shall observe a Sabbath of the Lord. 6 years sow your field, in the 7th year the land shall have a complete rest. That's Leviticus 25. And in case you missed it, these are the words of the Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael. In other words, where does Moshe start? He starts with Shemitah, Yovel, blessings and curses, which is to say Bahar and Bechukotai, Leviticus 25 and 26. And how did he conclude, Moshe, up there at the 7th year? These are the laws, statutes, and teachings. They said, okay, we're in. All right, and that is a reminder of what happened at Sinai, because remember, this is Parshat Bahar, the only time after Sinai that it references Sinai. And so there's a connection between this 7th year thing and what actually unfolded in that mythic moment at Sinai. And what was it that they said, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do when we will listen? It was Shemitah. Directly connected to the blessings and the curses. Radical release. What is it that we are letting go of this year? The process of letting go is never straightforward. There's backsliding, right? We could be letting go of fear and then Omicron variant, right? We can be letting go of grudges and then it's just rising up like bile inside us. We can let go of privilege. But how hard is that to really practice full solidarity? This is work. This is ongoing work. This is not just work for the 7th year. That is the ultimate gift of Shmita consciousness, is to spread things out over the long term and not kick ourselves for the growth and maturity that we haven't fully mustered yet. Similarly today, a very full morning, but we've only scratched the surface. So please come back on, sorry about these black things in the way, on March 19th, in the middle of the early afternoon, focus on sustainability. And in the packet, we've got all the confirmed speakers already for March and May. May Omicron be such come and gone that we can be here, but if not, we'll be here and we will have worked out the Zoom settings better, I promise. So yes, already confirmed, Debbie Trope, Cheryl Collins, Cheryl Israel, Naomi Evelson, all agriculture and Tikkun Olam experts. Seth Goldman on so many of these areas, Stu Simon, the energy angle, etc. And on May 1st, once it's really spring in the mid-afternoon, equity, race, and reparations, asking these meta questions. Jackie Glass is one of the presenters, Jesse Abraham, Elise Kaplan, Jeff Rubin, who I know is on, Stephanie Firestone, Marilyn Kresge-Wolf, who I saw, and Mirala again for that one as well. And one more time, thank you to Mirala as a co-conspirator in so much of this. So we have a lot to look forward to, and that is the end for now. But the work continues. Blessings on this Shemitah year, blessings on this solstice occasion, blessings as winter break unfolds, and a reminder that we are here for you through all of the ups and downs of whatever lies ahead. Honored to do this in sacred community. Go Adat Shalom, go Shemitah.
I noticed that March 19th is a Saturday. Do you mean March 20th?
I meant March 20th. Thank you. Fix the typo.